Hi, everyone. Welcome back. We're going to continue our Thomas Hobbes's book, Leviathan. So far, we have encountered his analysis of human psychology in Leviathan in the chapter titled On the Difference of Manners. We've also looked at his critique of divine right. And last time, we had a look at his famous exploration of the natural condition in chapter 13. So in this video, we're going to try to account for his argument regarding the transition from the natural condition to civil society, or what we would basically call society. All right, and then we will try to find some concluding points for Leviathan. All right, so just to take us back to this image, which is the frontispiece for the first edition of Leviathan, Hobbes is making a very powerful argument in the context of the English Civil War, which is advocating for a particular kind of sovereignty. And the reason that we are going to need a kind of absolute sovereignty or a kind of monarchy is because of the nature of humanity, which he has concluded is egotistical, self-interested, and in the absence of any authority, inclined to war. So if you notice in this image, we have at the top of the mountain, as it were, a monarch, which will sort of be the sovereign, and composing that sovereign are little people, which Hobbes will call the multitude. So a stable commonwealth in his mind will be the unity of the sovereign leader, and the people. And you can notice also on the left and right panels of the frontispiece are the different institutions that will ultimately make up civil society, institutions like the church, the military, and so on. A great deal of Leviathan will be a detailed analysis of the inner workings of such a commonwealth. We aren't really going to have time to explore those details in their completeness throughout the book, but I do want us to understand at least the argument and the logic underlying how Hobbes thinks we can achieve a peaceful and stable form of political co-belonging despite the conflict of human nature. So Hobbes is going to argue in chapter 14 that the state of nature is basically a miserable condition, right? Life is nasty, brutish, and short, and we all therefore should want to leave the state of nature and enter some form of society. The problem, though, that he acknowledges is that he has defined human nature as narrowly self-interested and egotistical and vainglorious. So, however, if he's correct about this nature, are people going to be persuaded to trust one another in a way that might be more cohesive for society? How are we ever going to be persuaded to give up our right to defend ourselves in the state of nature if we already know that the state of nature is a state of total war? Hobbes has a real kind of conflict on his hands in terms of identifying what it is about such a natural condition that might incline us to want society. Remember from the natural condition that Hobbes, for all of his pessimism, also does believe in the rationality of human individuals. But the kind of rationality he believes in only means being self-interested. And to put it in another way, it means preserving your life. To be rational means doing things that ensure and safeguard your survival. That's all rationality is in the Hobbesian universe. So notice that this is a very bleak and much more kind of greedy concept of rationality than we got in the figure of Socrates, let's say, where rationality had to do with knowledge of the good. And it's a very different kind of concept of rationality than we get in Epicurus, where Epicurus argued that knowledge of nature leads to happiness and well-being. Here, rationality is tied pretty starkly to survival alone. So the question he asks us essentially is, why would it be rational for egotists in the natural condition to prefer peace to the natural state? And so we have to think about this. If I'm a lone individual trying to fend for myself in the natural condition, and I can't really form any alliances with people, um, I can only expect a life that is going to be filled with perhaps violence and treachery, and basic necessity at best. Hobbes thinks that actually these rational agents can see that it is ultimately in their best interest to prefer a condition of peace than the condition of war. Why? Because in a condition of peace, I have more time, I have a longer life within which I can pursue my narrow, greedy self interest, right? Uh, so Hobbes is going to argue that the kind of crux of the formation of a peaceful society is what he calls a social contract. So a social contract is really the foundational concept of all political theory in terms of what is at the foundation of states, laws, and governments. All right. There are many different varieties of social contract theory in political theory, but Hobbes's version is perhaps the most influential, I would at least argue. So the first kind of way of understanding what a contract is in this context is to think of it as an agreement or form of consent between individuals over the type of social structure that they are going to make. So a contract can be either formal, that is written down and very specifically elaborated, as is the case in the American Constitution. I think the American Constitution is a case of a kind of explicit social contract in which the rights of human beings are enumerated. But there could also be all kinds of implicit social contracts in modern society, countries where there is no explicitly elaborated constitution, perhaps, but there is a kind of tacit or habitual understanding that we are living under certain kinds of mutual cooperation. All right. So you could think of the contract as an agreement between individuals over the rules that will prevail in society and reproduce the individuals of society in terms which are agreed upon on a more or less equal basis. Okay. I know this is all very abstract, and our mind doesn't really, when thinking about politics, tend to like these big abstract general notions. We prefer policies and specific ideas, but it is important, I think, to get a sense for this wider logic in Hobbes' thought. Hobbes essentially gives us a three concept maneuver here, where he sort of lays down a list of three concepts that will provide the basis for elevating humanity from the natural condition to civil society. All right. And he spends the first pages of chapter 14, which is called, the first and second natural laws and of contracts, and then focuses on their meaning. The first he calls right, which is the concept jus natural. The second is liberty. And the third is the law of nature, lex naturalis. So all three of these are occurring in your books from pages 99 through 103, if you want to have a look for yourself. And I'll just walk you through a little bit each of these terms. So the law of nature is really the idea that all human beings have an inbuilt or inborn need to survive the natural condition, right? We're all sort of programmed to act in the way that Hobbes described in the natural condition. And the law of nature refers to the fact that no one will do anything to voluntarily undermine their chances of survival. No one will opt to do anything to destroy themselves in the natural condition. So the idea here is that if a social contract is going to be constructed with the consent of individuals, it has to be responsive to this law of nature. No social contract that violates the law of nature, which is a law of survival, will be a social contract that works in the long term. Okay, so Hobbes' social contract can never take away that law of nature. What about right? We're used to thinking about rights in a very habitual way in the context of American society. And Hobbes, in a way, grounds right, or his concept of right, in nature itself. So his concept of right here is very close to the law of nature, but it refers essentially to the freedom of motion and the freedom of agency I have in nature to protect myself from the threats of nature, right? So right you can think of as a freedom or as a positive category, and law is more of this restrictive or negative version of the same category, all right? Liberty is essentially a negative term. It means the absence of external impediment or the absence of external constraint. And it's a condition that I find myself in, and we all find ourselves in the natural condition, where we can do whatever it is we see fit to survive in the state of nature. Another way to language this is to think of it as the absence of coercion, or the absence of some kind of higher authority that might violate my law of nature. So we have these kind of building block terms, right? We have law of nature, we have liberty, and we have right of nature. All right. And in a way, Hobbes is going to try to construct some kind of contract or terms of contracts, which will, in effect, retain these basic building blocks. Okay. So what do we have to do as self-interested humans who don't trust each other and are in a condition of total war? Hobbes argues that the first step on the road to peace is the laying down of a right. And that sounds sort of vague, and it's unclear why we would lay down rights if Hobbes has just said that rights are naturally, essentially codified in terms of our need to survive. What Hobbes is talking about here is essentially the idea that we need a kind of universal or mutual agreement that we will give up our right to all things in nature. In other words, we will give up the circumstance that I can do whatever it is I want to do to survive, including harming you or killing you, right? Or stealing your property. We all have to, in some generalized sense, agree to give up that basic condition, all right, in order for society to start to take some shape. So think of the exchange as a kind of a give and a take. I'm giving up my right to all things in nature on the condition that you and everyone else in the Commonwealth will do the same. So we are all collectively agreeing to give up our natural right to all things in nature. Now Hobbes recognizes that that's a very abstract proposal, and if I'm an individual who is fending for himself, I might want a little more clarity and a little bit more of a sense of focus, that if I give up my right, others will do so, and I will see some kind of benefit in the exchange relation, because Hobbes has claimed, and we might disagree with his premise, but his premise is that we are self-interested and we only do things out of self-interest. So if I'm going to be persuaded to lay down my right to all things in nature, I need it to come with some kind of backing, some kind of guarantee that it will be in my best interest to do so. All right. So to get more clarity on this, Hobbes identifies two forms of laying down a right that social form contracts can take. First, he says people can renounce their rights, and the second, he says, is a transfer. All right. So let's just look at each one of these a little bit more closely. Renouncing is essentially a giving up of rights for no clear reason that it will be reciprocated with a benefit. It's just kind of saying, I agree to divest myself of the natural right I have to all things in nature, and I don't need to see anything coming my way. Uh, Hobbes says that under no circumstances will people agree to renounce their right to all things in nature without some appeal to their rationality, because it would essentially amount to a violation of their fundamental law of survival, right? The transfer will be the privileged category here, in that a transfer obliges both parties or all parties to mutually uphold the terms of the contract. So a transfer is more like an economic relationship, in as much as there is meant to be equality in what is given up and equality in what is paid back, as it were. All right. So the social contract is the mutual transferring of rights amongst all of the persons in the state of nature, such that the result of the contract codifies the protection of certain rights that are not merely natural, but are grounded in nature. All right. So this is often used to describe the social contract. Think of the contract as the deep structure of liberal civil society. It's kind of the skeleton, as it were, or the foundation of all society. Before there is any specific government or specific kind of legislation or specific kind of economy, we have this more general fundamental relationship of mutually contracting parties agreeing through consent to the terms of protection and equality that they are going to establish. Okay. Now, Hobbes recognizes a problem here in what he is advocating. And the problem stems from human nature, right? From the egotism and the diffidence that he has been describing throughout Leviathan. And the idea is that if we agree that human beings are mistrusting of one another and rational, self-seeking agents, why would such an individual ever be comfortable with the idea that they should give up some of their rights simply because they're being told that they're going to get something out of it, right? What is going to guarantee that if I give up my right to all things in nature, that all people will similarly follow suit and do the same thing? It seems to be a little bit too flimsy, too loose, too vague of a contract to get skeptical and defensive egotists to agree, right? So Hobbes is going to delineate the social contract from an economic contract. He recognizes that unlike economic contracts, where the exchange of things or goods or commodities is an immediate exchange, or what economists often call a spot exchange, right? In other words, if you and I agree to, let's say, exchange a house for a sum of money, we can make that deal happen instantaneously in one day. I mean, usually it takes longer to sort out the details, but in principle, it's an exchange that occurs where the good is exchanged for the amount of money immediately. There need not be any hesitation on the part of either party, right? The social contract seems different than a spot exchange or an exchange of goods, in that the benefit that I am to receive from the terms of the contract are only arriving in the future, right? At some future date. So I'm kind of being asked to give up stuff today on condition that I will get something tomorrow. But why should I really believe that that will happen? Wouldn't it be rational for me to distrust such a proposal, right? Wouldn't it be more fair for me or more rational for me to demand that I see how the benefit is going to appear immediately rather than tomorrow, right? It seems that Hobbes is proposing something that has an inbuilt vulnerability to it, and he recognizes this, right? So he's going to try to find some kind of mechanism that will undo the vulnerability. So he uses this language, this biblical term, covenant, to describe the type of contract he is describing. The covenant is not an immediate spot exchange between parties, but is a relation over a future benefit between the parties, right? The covenant has to do with the sense that if I give up something today, my benefit will come in the future, right? So you can have a look at this language on 193. So there's this kind of structural risk involved in the voiding, the potential voiding of a contract by one of the partners. Um, let's say I really do give up my right to all things in the future, and you kind of say, yeah, great, you're going to do the same thing. But then when the moment comes, you fail to deliver your end of the bargain. So I need some extra mechanism to sort of assuage my anxiety that you're going to void the contract, right? Something has to bind us together to the terms of the contract in a way that is a little more binding or a little more rigid, right? So how are we going to do this? Hobbes describes a lot of ways in which social contracts can fail. So he's acknowledging that there are all kinds of weak or flimsy social contracts out there. He says that contracts made out of charity or a sense of trust to one's fellow human beings are invalid, right? They don't work. And they don't work because human beings are distrusting of one another as they rationally should be in the natural condition. So he'll describe these kinds of contracts as a free gift. In other words, a free gift is when I give something up my right to all things, and I see no reasonable expectation to get anything back. So he's saying that any society that is premised on a free gift or on a contract made out of just spoken words or good faith efforts or promises is not at all stable enough a foundation to remove people from the condition of total war. All right. So no one really ever gives up their right to all things in nature freely, unless they really have some obliging logic of necessity that will grant them a rational benefit that they can see in very clear and transparent terms. So a free gift or a contract made out of mutual trust is a violation of the law of nature. It's a violation because it is asking individuals to risk their survival, to risk their chances of living in a harsh wilderness where everyone is pitted against everyone else. All right. So we're not going to solve the problem of this state of nature through a free gift. So what is the alternative? What's the solution? For Hobbes, the solution is that we need some institution or some mediating third thing to ensure that all individuals who enter into the contract really do uphold their end of the bargain, right? So how do individuals feel secure when they're transferring their rights? What would make them feel secure in believing that if I give up my right to all things in nature, that my neighbor will do the very same thing? It can't just be that my neighbor says he will do that, right? That's just a free gift or a kind of sense of trust. But human nature is such that it's not rational to trust each other. What Hobbes proposes is that we all have to collectively transfer our right in nature to a kind of external and transcendent power or authority, something that is going to stand over us and rule over us, and that we're all equally going to be afraid of, right? We're all going to be afraid of that authority's punishment, capacity to punish, right? So we're kind of collectively enlisting something that will be greater than us to enforce the terms of the contract for us, right? That's really the basic shape of the contract, right? So try to think about what this authority could be. It's not going to be God because we're done with divine right. It's not going to be a particular church, right? We've shown how that institution no longer works as the form of governance for civil society. What will it be in moving forward that forces us to obey a social contract? And for Hobbes, the answer is the sovereign, the head of state, as we would call it, or the government, to use it in more American language. The sovereign authority is the entity that stands above the multitude, but is yet a part of the multitude. And the reason that the contract is ensured through the authority of the sovereign is that the sovereign imposes its will on all individuals with the force of the law. And so rather than being afraid of each other, we're afraid of the sovereign. So Hobbes has kind of mobilized the power of divine right in a sense and transferred it over to this new kind of authority that will hold good for modernity, the sovereign. Hobbes argues that the power of the sovereign must be an absolute power, that sovereign must be all awe-inspiring and something that we all equally cower before in order for the glue of the social contract to really solidify, right? If I have any sense that the sovereign's authority is not real or is flimsy or is vulnerable, well, then I'm probably not going to see any reason to believe that the contract will work, right? So the sovereign must be above the law in Hobbes's conception. The sovereign must stand before and above the law and impose the terms of the contract through the law. So absolute sovereignty is the condition for the establishment of civil society in Hobbes. And the key institution that the sovereign is enlisted to safeguard is the institution of private property. Once I have my property and I'm able to pursue my own best interests through the economy, through wealth, through self-seeking competitive behavior, which Hobbes argues is the nature of human being, then we have entered a commonwealth, a true commonwealth in which the multitude, the many, becomes a unity in the figure of the sovereign, who is the foundation of peace, of a truly unified and stable social order. All right. So once we have a social contract, it's actual, and human beings are protected with the law and can pursue their interests through private property, we have officially left the state of nature and entered civil society. We have entered a commonwealth. In civil society, we now are in a condition of peace if the sovereign is doing his job and if human beings are responding to the force of law. And therefore, we've left the kind of solitary, nasty, brutish, and short condition of nature. We now are able to fulfill our desire for power. Our law of nature, our law of survival is safeguarded by the sovereign, and therefore civilization and with it the institutions of morality and education, military, and so on can develop over time. Okay, so as I said before, Hobbes moves on to add so many different institutions into the Commonwealth, into that final state. But ultimately, I just want you to understand this relationship of a contract enlisting self-seeking individuals into a condition of mutual protection that is guaranteed by the state and the key institution of the state being the law, right? So just a very brief summary of the Leviathan, of this very complex work of political theory. And we learn in the difference of manners that human beings are motivated by power above all, that we are very restless and self-seeking individuals who are narcissistic, but that we do have a desire for submission to a common authority, right? Hobbes returns to that, of course, in chapter 14 and 15 in the concept of sovereignty. But he first wanted to address this kind of inner psychology in the difference of manners to sort of show how human beings are bound to relations of competition with one another. We walked through his critique of the tradition of divine right and the idea that religious authority is best positioned to govern individuals. And Hobbes argued that this is ultimately not true, and that religion is filled with irrationality and superstition, and that it is also ultimately a divisive form of governance rather than a form of governments that will provide secure unity and security over time. And then we looked at his very famous discussion of the natural condition and the idea that in the state of nature, in the absence of any law and authority, life is a miserable condition of total war. We are only individuals bound by the law of nature to pursue our own survival, And in the absence of any kind of social structure, we will be compelled to a very bitter and violent fight to the death, as it were. And so the natural condition is Hobbes's way of essentially holding up the risk of degeneration in modern civil society. What happens in conditions of civil war or in total conflict? Human beings regress to the state of nature, which is a state that no one wants, right? Ultimately, it is in our better interests to enter into relations of peace. The solution to peace or the solution to war is his concept of the sovereign, which is the essentially the referee of the social contract that requires individuals in this absolute condition of freedom to transfer their freedom to all things in nature to each other by mutually giving it over to the power of the sovereign, who is now authorized to use the force of law to ensure that civil society does not degenerate into civil war and the natural condition. So again, Hobbes is a very a kind of logical and kind of stark thinker. This is surely not a utopia or a vision of the world that we might aspire to, but he believes it is a realistic account of political life based on the rather negative reality of human nature. Now, we might disagree with that concept of human nature that Hobbes has here, and we will see that other thinkers, people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, ultimately think Hobbes was wrong about human nature, and that human nature is not so narrowly self-interested and narcissistic as he portrayed. So think about this argument for yourself before moving forward. Think about whether or not Hobbes is right about nature. Is it true that human beings in this natural condition would behave in this way? That is, would it be a total war of all against all? And therefore, also, is he right or wrong about the solution, about this idea of absolute sovereignty as the referee for the social contract? Is that the necessary form that politics has to take, or are there more free and perhaps democratic forms of political governance that could do the same work of ensuring a social contract that gives people the means to pursue self-interested ends in a way that is relatively peaceable and social? Okay, so that is pretty much going to do it for Hobbes. We are going to move forward with our political philosophy unit. Please have another look at the core concepts from chapter 14 to get clear on how Hobbes moves from those natural traits to the social contract. Make sure you understand how he develops that transition.